Hello, and welcome to our program, Where God Weeps, a program where we speak about the situation of the suffering church around the world. The Middle East is facing an unprecedented challenge. War and humanitarian crises are destroying nations and blurring long-held borders. To tell us more, it's my great privilege to welcome Professor Joshua Landis. Professor Landis is the head of the Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma and a specialist in Syria. Professor Landis, thank you for being with us here today in our program.
Mark, thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Professor Landis, I think for the purposes of our discussion, because the situation is so complex, I'd like to break it down into three main blocks. First of all would be the question of nation states, the disintegration of nation states that we're seeing today. The second block would be Sunni Shia, the power between these two within Islam, these two traditions within Islam, and the power and the proxy wars struggle that's going on within Sunni and Shia Islam. And then thirdly would be this question of ISIS. How does ISIS fit into the picture? So we look at Iraq. Iraq is in crisis. Libya has already completely exploded as a nation state. It doesn't exist anymore. Syria in the middle of a brutal civil war. And finally, Yemen, where there's also a battle for power. We're speaking about a redefinition today of the nation state. If the nation state, as what we understand the nation state to be, is disintegrating, what's going to replace it? Are we going back to tribalism? And then is democracy as a system something that is applicable to the Middle East?
Well, that's an excellent question, and we don't know where we're headed, really. There's a big foggy future out here. But we're seeing that tribal identities, confessional identities, religious identities, clan-based, all sorts of identities that were prevalent and are overlapping with national identities are coming to the fore. In this time of emergency and national breakdown, people are reverting to any other identity that can protect them. And we are seeing the collapse of the nation state. All these nations that were carved out at the end of World War I and established were weak, and they were competing with these internal national identities, but also pan-identities like Islam, the Caliphate, identities like Pan-Arabism. So those identities were constantly competing. But underneath it all, I think we have to recognize the tremendous economic pressures, because I think a lot of this is about economy. In the same way that Europe after World War I was leveled economically, and without that economic crisis, you can't understand the rise of fascism and authoritarianism in Europe.
Absolutely.
And you can't understand, I think, this collapse of the state in the Middle East. The youth bulge, tremendous. Middle Eastern countries are extremely young, and young countries are prone to revolution. Iraq and Syria, median age, 21 years old. Tunisia, the great example of a country that seems to be making the transition to democracy, median age is 29, 30. And that's what sociologists say is, in a sense, the tipping point between countries that get successful, more than 50% success to transition. Egypt, 24% median age. Palestine, Gaza, Yemen, 19 years old. So in a sense, once you break down the state, authority goes into the hands of these 19-year-olds. It's like letting the high school run society. It's a scary thought.
Except for the fact that the majority, particularly in Egypt, 40% of the young people in Egypt are illiterate.
And they're unemployed. I mean, in the next decade, there is expected to be about 250 million people below the age of 21 in the Middle East. 45% unemployment. What do you do when a young person comes out of college or high school and sees no prospects, has no way to make a family? They're disposed to any radical group that comes along, and that's the baseline. And we're seeing the crumbling. There's been bad government. MENA area, the Middle East, North Africa, has been the second worst performing area for decades.
You're talking economy now.
We're talking economy.
Economy.
Economy and government. Africa is the worst, has been the worst. There's some bright spots in Africa, but there's others that, and so I think the challenge for the 21st century really is going to be dealing with the tremendous economic pressures, the disparities between North and South, between developed world and developing world. We've talked about those disparities in the 60s and 70s, but we're going to see, I think, a tremendous crushing of government authority, because this youth bulge, unemployment, all the pressures we're seeing, demographic explosion in places like Central Africa, Nigeria, Sudan, so forth. That's the next line. I think the Arab Spring, in a sense, is the canary in the mine shaft. And what we're seeing in terms of immigration to Europe and to the successful economies is just the beginning, could be just the beginning. The world needs to figure out a way to adjudicate and to deal with this immigration flow, which I think is going to continue, if not get worse, for some time in the future.
I would agree with you. I think that there's a great concern in Europe about this. I want to go back. We've spoken now about the economy and the youth, the nation state, the disintegration of the nation state, but we haven't come to a political model that will respond. So if tribalism is not the question, and democracy doesn't seem to be working, the democratic structures, or my question to you, is democracy the answer? What else is? What's the future?
Democracy does not seem to be the answer in the short term. And America, I think, has been very misguided in the way it's dealt with the Middle East, because in a sense, the American religion is democracy. And under George Bush, the expectation was the world was ready for it. And America needed to kick down a few doors in order to let the air of democracy in and democracy to take hold, this fourth wave. We'd seen Eastern Europe, we'd seen Latin America, and now, boom, it's the Middle East turn. And we kicked over government structures in Iraq, thinking that some new power-sharing model that was better would come along, and of course we've seen something worse. At least we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel today, and the amount of human damage has been tremendous. And we're seeing that in Libya. Kick over the government structures, nothing better comes to replace them. We get this tribalism, resurgence of these other identities. Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. We don't have a successful model of democracy promotion. So this suggests caution, much greater caution. These weak state structures that have taken root to a certain extent can easily be broken down, and that's going to increase human suffering tremendously. So this preaches modesty, I think, to world leaders. We don't know what comes next. I do believe we're going to see chaos for a long time to come in the Middle East before new state structures can emerge.
But ultimately, democracy still for you is the long-term goal.
I think it has to be. It has to be because we don't see an alternative organizing principle. Obviously, dictatorship, various forms of authoritarianism. And monarchy works in the Middle East. Monarchy, as it did in Europe for thousands of years. Monarchy works as a form of regime change from father to son, because it has certain legitimacy. You don't want to get rid of those monarchies before there are prerequisites for democracy, and it requires prerequisites, a certain socioeconomic level, literacy. I mean, we can go through a whole bunch of prerequisites that most people are familiar with, but they were not present in countries like Iraq, Syria, and Libya. So why we would expect to get democracy when there were not the prerequisites? The problem is that we hated the regimes, and we fooled ourselves into thinking that something better was going to come.
Presumes the next question, the next block of our conversation, that is religion. We're talking about Islam, particularly in this region, and the power struggle ongoing at the moment between Shia and Sunni. And I would like, if it's possible for you in a simple way, if you could break down a little bit the influences, where we're seeing these influences coming from. And if you will, I think we're seeing proxy wars between Shia, presumably Iran, and Sunni, which would be Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others, and how these influences are also playing a fundamental, critical role in what we're seeing in the Middle East today?
Well, we have seen a breakdown of convivienda, of ability to live together that has prevailed in most of the Middle East for centuries. And it is being exploited by this proxy war. But we've seen this sort of steady lurching towards the bottom. The Iranian Revolution, 79, a fundamentally important moment, but also 67 war. Most historians and political scientists start with 67 because Pan-Arabism, secular Arab nationalism, and secular nationalism prevailed in the Middle East after World War II. Nasser, Saddam Hussein, people like Assad, Boumediene, the Yemeni, Arafat, these were secular nationalist movements. They were discredited in 1967 when Nasser failed to get an Arab nation united to take on Israel. Israel won. Islamists looked to that war and said, Jews were loyal to their religion. They believed in a Jewish state. We believed in these paganistic dictators who are setting themselves up as God, preaching nationalism, authority from the people, not authority from God. We need to return to a true Islam. And then you get the Iranian Revolution, a successful theocracy that seemed to be strong, strident preaching, and religious movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, who survived the prisons of these secular dictators, were the only group willing to go year after year, sacrifice martyrs, challenging these corrupt state structures. So they gained a luster of martyrs, sacred luster. And that's why today, as these state structures collapse, religious parties are there. They're organized, they're powerful, they have legitimacy because of this struggle. And it's faute de mieux. The other ideologies, whether it's leftist communism, whether it's nationalism, have been discredited. Secularism went into form of dictators and prisons. So religion has captured.
Seems to be the only solution in the eyes of the Muslim. Everything else, so what's left is the Ummah, is the community of the Muslim.
And the Caliphate. Going back, you look at the Golden Age. The Golden Age, Caliphate. We've left our religion, we need to come back to it. Yeah. And these are the simple answers made for the 19 and 20-year-old who's out there at the front lines.
Brings me to the next point of our conversation, ISIS. ISIS has controlling large swaths of power. Ultimately, they want to go from the Mediterranean all the way to Saudi Arabia, with the idea of a caliphate, which throws us back to the 7th century. The idea where men, the Salafist with a long beard, the traditional long cloak, chewing a root, cleaning the teeth with a root, all of these coming from the time of Muhammad, because as we've been speaking, everything else has failed. So let's go back to the pure, the time of Muhammad, and we start again from there. My question is the ISIS, the caliphate, a viable solution? And secondly, is the caliphate the sign of the Islam in crisis, the crisis of identity of Islam?
I think it is a sign of the crisis. And I think it is an apotheosis. ISIS is an apotheosis of this movement towards religious nationalism. In the same way that Nazi Germany was apotheosis of a national movement that had been going on since the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the creation of nation states. We have today 193 nation states. They're new. This is a modern movement. Before that, bishoprics, tribal organizations, free cities, caliphates, emirates, all kinds of political concatenations, but not nation states. So nation state is a reorganizing on a new principle. ISIS is trying to use religious nationalism, and it's taken it to its furthest extremes. And as you say, resurrecting these, bringing back slavery, all kinds of crazy ideas, concubinage and so forth. But they have an element of legitimacy. And a lot of Muslims are given pause because they see this, they see that it does have this, it harkens back, and they don't know what to do. They feel humiliated. So they're giving it the benefit of the doubt. And here, what Baghdadi, the caliph, did was he gave an image of these soldiers dressed in uniform going 2 by 2 with great weapons coming out of these long lines of Toyota pickups, all uniformly colored. This was not the guerrilla warfare of bin Laden in some mountain cave. This was a modern army taking on America, blowing up trucks, his propaganda movies. It seemed to suggest, now of course this was imagery more than reality, that you could go back. You could get a caliphate. You could say, you know, stick it to these nation states, to the West, who has this model laid out for you. You're going to walk along that path towards democratization and nationalism. And they say, no, we don't have to do it. And so I think that's very attractive. It's going to fail. It's going to fail. The West is powerful. That's nation state, democracy, sovereignty of man. These are of the nation, not the kings, caliphs. The national revolution turns authority 180 degrees on its head. The sovereigns become the servants of the people. The nation, the people, become the sovereigns. And that has been, going on for the last 2 centuries. And I think we're in the middle of it in places like the Middle East.
Is ISIS a reflection of Islam and an identity crisis of Islam? And how do we in the West respond to this?
I think it is. I think Islam is in the middle of a terrible crisis. Not unlike religious wars in Europe, the Enlightenment, all this sort of compressed, of course, into a very short period of time. Tons of liberal-minded Muslims are horrified at what they see. On the other hand, they don't know how to battle it. They don't know how to come against ISIS because ISIS is paralyzing these liberal Muslims by saying, I'm Islamic, look at this, read this verse, see, the Prophet did this, there was slavery, Abu Bakr burnt up this guy, we can burn up the Jordanian. And you don't know how to answer. You can't just throw out your tradition and say, no, we're going to start over again. You have to find new arguments. And I think liberals are very busy finding new arguments, picking out lines like there's no compulsion in religion, saying we should not focus uniquely on Sharia law. This fetishism of law has misguided the true message of Islam, which is rahmah, forgiveness, compassion, and that it is things like compassion you have to focus on. Law takes us sometimes away from that. And so the liberals are fighting that war, and they're weak today. In a crumbling nation where the economy is the message, stupid, and so forth, we're getting this Islamic crisis. But it's out there. It's ready to be picked up when rebuilding goes along. How can the West? I think the West has to get out of the way to a certain extent. We need to protect our borders, but we cannot occupy countries like Iraq and create this new world for them. It isn't going to work. And we've tried 4 different methods, as you pointed out earlier, 4 different methods. We kicked over the dictator and left in Libya. We tried to adjudicate a change of regime in Yemen. We occupied full-on in Iraq. We've done everything we could, and each one has failed. I don't think there is a right way to do it in Syria. And many commentators have said, oh, if only Obama had done X, Y, and Z red lines in the first year. I don't agree with it. I don't think we missed an opportunity. I don't think there was an opportunity for the West. And that makes it very difficult because in a sense we're powerless. But we need counterterrorism, weaken the worst, do a little bit here and there, patchwork, and protect ourselves. And wait for this storm to go by. It's what we did with the rise of fascism. Well, we defeated Hitler, but we couldn't stop the Great Sorting Out in Central Europe. It happened even when we were an occupying force. The Sudeten Germans were kicked into Germany. We couldn't stop that.
What about a model? If we need to look at a country where it could work, would Egypt be a model? I address Egypt because President al-Sisi has spoken against violence in Islam in a speech that he gave at the Al-Azhar University. He has removed Article 2 of the Constitution in Egypt. Sharia is still the inspiration, but Article 29 was removed, which was the application of Sharia. Egypt is the only country within, other than Jordan and Israel, for example, but that the social fabric of a majority Muslim country is still holding together. Is Egypt a potential model that other countries could look to and say, yes, this could be a model for us?
Boy, that's a complicated question, and I have to tread very delicately here because I don't know what lies in the future. My intuition tells me that Egypt is not really the model. Egypt is a holding model. And Egypt is Sisi, is Mubarak, is Assad. Sisi is what we've seen in the past. And Egypt was torn between those who wanted some kind of secular government and those who wanted a religious government. And in a sense, we've gone back to secular, but it's being policed by a dictator. And yes, he's preaching nonviolence, but he's using violence. He's outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. He's killed over 1,000. So I don't see it as the answer. Tunisia is the answer. But Tunisia has qualities. Average age of 30 years old that I've gone through. It has been a long history close to Europe. The Ghannouchi, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Nahda, lived in Europe for 20 years. He's committed to nonviolence. These are unique or almost unique qualities that you see in Tunisia. It's a whole cluster of reasons that Tunisia has emerged successfully. I don't know how you replicate that. And I think Middle Easterners don't know either. Turkey is a potential model as well. I mean, Turkey went through this secularization problem, nation state, big middle class, resurgent growth of 7, 8, 9% economically for years. Looked like Erdogan was taking power away from the military, the Kemalists, and putting it in the parliament. Of course, we've seen more recently,
he's becoming more
and more
autocratic.
He's becoming a dictator himself. But those are the different poles, and the Middle East is experimenting with these different things. And I think there is a role for authoritarianism, Sisi authoritarianism in the future.
I suppose my question here is because if we draw on Turkey as a model, we've seen, I'm now speaking as a Christian in this perspective, we've seen Christians drop from 20% of the population now down to 0.2%. In some ways, I agree with you. I feel that we have to tread very carefully, but at the same time, Christians are being decimated in this whole landscape. Christians, which were the origins at the root of the societies well before Islam came into many of these countries in the Middle East, Christians were there. And in standing back and watching, effectively what we're going to do is stand and watch the Christians be pushed out of their homeland. So what do we do for the Christians? How do we assure that the Christians who serve as the buffer between the Sunni and the Shia in many of these countries are going to be pushed out, which means we're going to see divisions along religious lines, Sunni sections of Iraq, Shia sections of Iraq. What about the future of Christians in the Middle East?
Well, I think the Turkish model, again, is very, is instructive. Turkey wiped out its Christians, as you say. 20%, 1914, by 1923, the end of the Turkish Revolution, less than 1% today, 200,000 Christians, less than that, in a country of 80 million. Gone. But if we look at the other side of that, all the Christians from Turkey, Syria, in a sense are fleeing, many of them are fleeing back into Turkey. Now, what kind of reception are they going to get? They've been taken in. Now, it shows you how plastic and how rapidly changing this political landscape is. Take Germany. World War II, the apotheosis of fascistic nationalism, totally intolerant, wiping out the Jews and other minorities. Today, Mama Merkel, accepting in the other, all these immigrants, busting open Europe and saying, yes, you're welcome, setting that example. Germany being, who would have guessed it 60 years ago? Transformed. Now, there are clearly bumpy ride ahead. We don't know what's going to happen to Europe, the rise of the right, so forth. But to come back to the Turkish story, it may be that Turkey, in a sense, has had this sorting out 100 years ago. It's still not finished between Kurds and Turks, but there may be a place for Christians in Turkey in the future, is what I'm saying, in the same way that Germany today is much more multicultural and is looking for a way towards multiculturalism. I'm not sure they've found it, but it's certainly exploring that. Is there, the short-term message for the Christians in Iraq and Syria? Miserable. You can't sugarcoat this in any way. The Christians in Syria are begging Americans not to push aside Assad. They're saying, look, Assad owns 20% of Syria. inside that 20%, 65 to 70% of the citizens live. Christians all live within the Assad side. You go to the rebel side, there's not a Christian left. Maybe you find a few, but they're the exceptions that prove the rule. They've been ethnically cleansed. Look what ISIS has done. ISIS owns 50% of Syria, not a Christian living under ISIS. And Al-Qaeda in Idlib area, there were 100 Christian families in Idlib. They left within 2 to 3 days once this rebel coalition with Al-Qaeda at its heart took over. And that's been the story right through Syria. So they're saying, America, do not forsake us. Do not ask for a Sunni ascendancy in the name of democracy. Because it's going to mean a wasteland. It's going to mean ethnic cleansing. It's not democracy. We're not ready for democracy. And that, I think that puts Christians up against this terrible dilemma. Because especially for American Christians. Because our national religion is democracy. But as a Christian, you want to protect fellow Christians. You don't want to see that ethnic cleansing. And we need modesty in our sense of knowing what the right answer is. The Middle East and Syria are not ripe for democracy today. We're not going to have a democracy in the next 10 or 20 years. How do you save that diversity, that mosaic that still exists in Damascus, along the coast, in parts of Syria? And Russia has jumped in and said, I'm not going to let this go. Should America be against Russia? Throw in weapons and encourage Saudi Arabia and Turkey to throw in more TOW missiles and more advanced weapons in order to kill the Russians and drive them out, outbid them? Or should we accommodate the Russians and say, okay, let's find a ceasefire. Let's end this fighting.
And then see if we can find a political solution.
Find a political solution that may not be perfect, but at least keeps people where they are.
Professor Landis, unfortunately our time has come to an end. It's been great to hear this, and I think we just need to pray for, as you say, a quick end to the war and a political solution for all the populations concerned. Thank you very much for having been with us today.
Well, thank you for asking me on. It's a great honor.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today in our program, Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more information about the situation of Christians in Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, I would encourage you to look at the contact information at the end of this program. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.